In the winter of 2004, as holiday lights began to flicker across American neighborhoods and office phones hummed with last-minute planning, a woman from Waukesha, Wisconsin stepped aboard a ship to trade the cold for a week of sun and salt air. Her name was Annette Marie Mizener. At 37, she had the quick laugh of someone who had learned to keep moving, even when life threatened to slow her down. She was a mother, 2 children by birth, 2 more adopted not long before, and, together with her husband, the co-owner of a small, earnest company that sold vitamins and natural supplements. The business had been a source of pride and strain in equal measure. They had dreams of growth, and the paperwork of bankruptcy filed months earlier lingered like a quiet worry at the edge of every family dinner. When Annette's parents surprised her and her teenage daughter with tickets for a week aboard the Carnival Pride, it felt like a reset, a chance to breathe and step away from the worry, laughter on the deck, the tiny drama of cruise ship life, the promise of coming home refreshed. For the first days of the voyage, she was herself, present at the buffet before dawn, teasing her mother about overly bold sunscreen, squinting at the horizon with a camera that shook in her hands. She joined trivia nights and took a turn singing at the karaoke bar, her voice steady and warm. Passengers who struck up casual conversation remembered a woman generous with a smile, the kind who asked after strangers' lives as if she believed small kindness mattered. Yet those who knew her best noticed small fissures, a terse call from her husband that left her quiet for an hour, a moment when she told her mother she felt as though someone on the ship had been looking at her too much. Her mother filed that away with the rest of vacation anxieties, food sensitivities, seasickness, but would not forget it. On December 4th, the ship moved south along the Mexican Riviera, its itinerary bright with daytime ports and onboard entertainment. The schedule promised arrival in Long Beach the next morning. The night was warm enough that people lingered on decks in light jackets, watching satellite stars shimmer above the black band of the ocean. Annette had plans, simple, ordinary plans. She intended to meet her daughter at the teen club after a cocktail reception, to walk the deck and take a few photographs of the lights reflecting on the water. At 9:15 in the evening, a crew member and a fellow passenger saw her near the aft, walking toward the lower decks with her beaded purse swinging at her side. It was a small, familiar bag, its beads threaded into a pattern she favored. She carried it everywhere during the trip. That sighting would be the last confirmed one. When Annette did not show at the teen club, unease rippled outward. A quick search by the family within the ship's corridors became more frantic as minutes passed into hours. Crew announcements were made, the ship's internal search protocol initiated, and by late night, passengers' quiet conversations had hardened into concerned murmurs. At around 11, a passenger on a lower deck found a purse resting against the base of a 3-foot railing on a smoking deck. An odd place for Annette, her family would say later. She did not smoke and avoided those decks. The purse contained her identification, her cruise card, a smear of lipstick, and the familiar, now fragile beads. Several beads were missing. Whatever had happened to cause the purse to end up there had not registered as one more laughable mishap. It registered as wrong. Security footage of the area presented complications. Investigators later reported there was a gap, a 15-minute blackout during the time frame when Annette disappeared. Crew members described the gap as a technical malfunction, a glitch in the ship's recording system. Some passengers would later tell reporters that a camera lens near the smoking deck had been covered with tape when the purse was found. Others insisted no one could have covered it without being seen. The difference between technical error and intentional alteration would widen into a fault line of distrust that split investigators, family members, and those watching the story unfold on the news. Within hours, the ship's captain had notified the Coast Guard. Aerial and sea-based searches began before dawn as the Carnival Pride made its scheduled return to Long Beach. Planes crisscrossed the sheen of black water 30 miles off Ensenada. Searchlights pierced the salt spray, and the foam of wakes receded into darkness where nothing was found. The ocean, for all its drama in stories, can be deceptively indifferent. Debris does not always float where we expect. A purse may bob and bob again until the tide takes it out of view. A person may vanish into depths that belie the gaze of searchers and the certainty of loved ones.
In the days that followed, media outlets began to gather threads of the tale into a narrative. Some anchors treated it as a maritime mystery. A woman disappears from a cruise ship. Where is she now? Other angles focused on private life and motive. Bankruptcy filings from earlier that year, marital tensions reported by neighbors, the frantic calls exchanged in the last month between Annette and her husband. These facts were laid out not as evidence, but as possible explanations. When a life goes missing, everything in that life is sifted through like sand in a sieve, with the reporters and public seeking something solid to hold up. Annette's family bristled at this. Her parents pushed back, insisting neither depression nor self-harm fit the woman they knew. She had just adopted 2 children. She had been making plans to move the business into new markets. There were reasons to be anxious in her life, but there were reasons, too, to keep going. The official investigation moved through a familiar choreography. Interviews with crew, timelines reconstructed from card scans and sign-ins, forensic sweeps of public areas. Crew logs claimed that Annette's cabin door had been locked that night, and that her personal effects were in order, save for the purse. Witness interviews produced fragments of sound. A passenger who reported hearing an argument around 9:30, another who said he heard a loud thud near the rail. But in the cramped, half-lit corridors of witness testimony, memory is porous. Sound is easily mistaken. The man who said he had heard a woman running thought later that he might have been hearing the thump of a cart. A teenager recalled a silhouette, but in the blur of deck lights and late-hour fatigue, recollections softened. The investigators did their best to fix these impressions into a coherent timeline, but the gaps were stubborn. As the days blended, investigators explored 3 primary theories: accidental fall, suicide, and foul play. Each had its counterarguments. An accidental fall was plausible. A ship's railing is not impossibly high, and a misstep or a sudden lurch of the vessel could send someone over. But Annette's family emphasized she would not have been on that lower deck. She disliked smoke and crowds, and had never been fond of the smoky, seaward-facing alcoves. The suicide theory, while it gained traction among a certain subset of commentators, felt unlikely to those who knew her. The bankruptcy had been a strain, yes, but she had been buoyed by the recent adoptions and the prospect of rebuilding. That left foul play. Someone on the ship behaving in a predatory or violent way. The missing beads and the covered camera lent credence to that possibility, but they were circumstantial. Without a body, without witnesses, without hard forensic proof tying someone to a crime, the case stubbornly resisted closure. Legal action followed the emotional. Months later, an attorney filed suit against the cruise line on behalf of the family, alleging negligence, failure to maintain adequate safety, failure to ensure that surveillance was functioning, failure to provide swift, effective search procedures. The cruise line's response was measured in legal language. The company expressed sympathy, promised full cooperation with investigators, and defended its protocols. Settlements and suits in these contexts rarely produce a satisfying public accounting. They exist at the meeting point of corporate risk management and private grief. For Annette's family, it was not about money as much as it was about accountability. an attempt to force an institution to reckon, even partly, with what had occurred within its walls. Yet the human side of the story, forgive the phrase, but it is essential, refused to remain tethered to legal filings and news cycles. Annette's daughter, a teenager thrust into the limelight when her mother vanished, woke into a world rearranged. Her parents' absence at home in Waukesha began to accumulate the way snow accumulates in a yard, quietly at first, then with weight. Friends offered casseroles, neighbors drove the children to school. The community showed up in small ways that meant everything. Annette's parents turned their grief into advocacy, pressing investigators for access to documents, to footage, to anything that might illuminate the final hours. They traveled to hearings, sat through depositions, and watched the search footage again and again, seeking a face in the blur. Those who worked the case on the law enforcement side carried the weight of professional frustration. Maritime disappearances are uniquely difficult to solve. By the time investigators can arrive on scene, the ocean has already claimed or moved evidence. Memories degrade. Ships pass through multiple jurisdictions, local Coast Guard, the federal authorities, and sometimes international actors depending on a vessel's flag. The Carnival Pride's logs and tapes were examined, but technical limitations of the ship's systems and the vagaries of witness recollection meant that science had limited purchase. The family held firm to a suspicion, foul play, because the available facts felt like a puzzle with too many forced edges. Over months and years, the story became a particular kind of ache, unresolved. Annette was declared legally dead in mid-2005, a formal recognition that the law can grant even when certainty has not been achieved. The declaration allowed practical matters to proceed, insurance claims, probate, but did not answer the burning human question: what happened on that deck that night? The public's interest waned as other headlines rose and fell, as happens with tragedies that offer no neat conclusion. That is perhaps one of the cruelties of modern attention. Unresolved events become a kind of private sorrow, receding from the daily news but not from the day-to-day lives of those who loved the vanished. In the years since, small details continued to surface. An interview with a crew member who recalled a late-night altercation in the smoking area, a recounting of noise heard but not understood, a retired investigator's lament over a lost evidence tape. But nothing coalesced into the hard proof that would satisfy a courtroom or ease a mother's grief. Family members clung to the certainty that Annette would not have chosen to walk away from her children. They remembered a woman finishing adoption paperwork with a visible lightness in her step. They remembered the way she fussed over vitamins labels, as if each ingredient deserved dignity. To them, the idea of self-harm did not match the textured life of the person they loved. True crime narratives often ask us to inhabit both the public and private parts of a case, the legal facts and the interpersonal truth. In Annette's story, the tension between those two realms is raw. The ship was full of people, passing strangers, a handful of characters whose minor actions would later be thrust into enormous significance. Cruise ship life breeds small intimacies, shared buffets, the same faces at sunrise on deck. People who would never otherwise have noticed each other briefly become co-stars in a tiny floating world. Within that compressed social sphere, motives can be ordinary, strange, or malevolent. It is the ordinary strangeness that is most chilling. How easily a day that begins with breakfast Nutella and camera phones can bend into a night of unanswered questions. There are lessons here about risk and responsibility. Cruise lines have improved surveillance, passenger check procedures, and onboard security training in the decades since incidents like this were more widely publicized. Technology has advanced. Cameras are higher resolution, GPS and passenger tracking systems more reliable. Yet no system is perfect. The sea remains an arena where certainty is partial at best. Investigations are hampered by time, by jurisdictional complication, and by the human limits of memory and fatigue. For Annette's loved ones, the absence is a presence. They mark anniversaries, they gather for birthdays, they speak her name aloud to keep it from becoming a whisper. The son, who was a small child at the time, grew into a teenager holding family photos that seemed to belong to another life. Community rituals keep memory alive. A bench engraved in her honor outside a community center. A small scholarship in her name for young entrepreneurs who need seed money. Echoes of the compassion she had once embodied in business and in daily life. In the larger cultural sense, the case presses urgent questions about how we value safety in spaces we think of as leisure. Tourists trust operators to provide a secure environment for their families. When those trusts fray, the public seeks both explanation and reform. Lawsuits and claims do not always bring the kind of public reckoning that feeds closure, but they can catalyze changes in policy and procedure that limit future harm. Annette's husband's decision to sue was covered in local papers, framed as both a bid for answers and a challenge to an industry whose images of carefree vacation contrast starkly with human tragedy. What remains